just love this morning. I just love what Jeannie shared with us as we were getting ready to get going. Being out in nature, taking a walk, and realizing that the tree right in front of her had provided a fruit. She didn't have to beg it. She didn't have to coerce it. She didn't have to light incense and dance in front of it. She just had to accept it. It was there. It was already there. And that is a beautiful and perfect example of where we're going today. It may be a roundabout trip, but it's where we're going today. Each and every one of us is limited in what we accept, what we let into our experience. We're limited in a couple of ways. One of the first ways is that typically, or most of the time, let me put it that way, most of the time, our experience comes to us through our five senses. And we know that there exist phenomena that the five senses can't even detect. So if you've ever had a dog whistle, you know that there's sound that exists at a range that the human ear can't hear, but the dog's ear can. We know that there are radio waves that we see as being visible. We call them light. And there's a certain band of the radio waves, electromagnetic waves, that our eyes are capable of detecting. But there are others that our eyes can't detect, and yet other animals can. They can see things that are there. They can experience, but we cannot. Just due to the physical construct, if you will, of the way that our eyes are put together. We're reading Joseph Selby's The Physics of God, which is kind of leading to lots and lots of discussions about just how miraculous life itself is. And I shared a video with the group, and it was a TED Talk, and the speaker was discussing how scientists are coming to believe now that the European red sparrow, I think it migrates from northern Africa to Europe and England, northern England, every year. And scientists were trying to understand, how does this tiny little bird find its way? How does it know? And there's all kinds of theories about different ways that animals know their path to migrate. But in this case, there's an idea being presented that, according to the speaker, an idea that's gaining some traction, that somehow this little creature is able to detect the quantum entanglement of electrons. And now I have to tell you, they talk about quantum physics, and I don't understand it. I don't understand regular physics. That's how I lost my college deferment and wound up in the Army. But this tiny little bird, without any effort on its own part, it didn't have to sit down and try to figure this out or work it out. This tiny little bird is able to detect a change in the entanglement of the electrons, and that change varies based on the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, which is otherwise typically too weak to detect. Now, if we just stop and think about that for a moment, just stop and think about how perfect life is, how magnificent life is, just beautiful little creature. Where did it come from? Why is it here? And how perfect is it that the intelligence that created the universe out of nothing out of an intention to let it be, has provided this little creature with the ability to do something that we have to build expensive colliders, tubes that run miles and miles and miles in a circle. We have to expend a tremendous amount of energy to detect these things, and yet it seems that this little creature does it without a thought. Without a thought. So what we're talking about is our spiritual prototypes, As we were reading Selby's book a couple weeks ago, he was introducing this idea of a hologram. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Star Wars, you've seen the hologram where the little robot R2-D2 projects this 3D image of Princess Leia asking for help. And a holographic image is a three-dimensional image. You can walk around it and it occupies space. It's not an illusion, like if you remember going to the drive-in when you were a kid and putting the glasses on and watching The Creature from the Black Lagoon, it's not like that at all. That's kind of an illusion where they take two offset images and your mind combines them and tries to make it look like 3D. This is an actual 3D image. So what Selby was saying is that, how many dimensions are there to the universe? How many dimensions are there? We're used to thinking of 3 dimensions, and then Einstein comes along and gives us the 4th dimension, which is time, and then string theory comes along and gives us, I think it's 11 dimensions in some schools of thought of string theory. And Selby says, if you think about how a hologram works, it is a 2-dimensional image. A laser beam is shown, projected onto this image, focused maybe is the right word, onto this image. And out of this 2-dimensional image becomes this 3D experience, So he was postulating, well, what if before all of these things that we experience in 3 dimensions, what if all of this were simply a projection from a two-dimensional universe? That all of this was simply this projection, this image that already exists somewhere else that is projecting onto this earth. Now, of course, I have no way of knowing, if any of that is true. It makes for interesting discussion, but I certainly don't have the background to be able to tell whether it's true or it's false. But it gives rise to some interesting discussion and some interesting conversation. So it reminded me of what Dr. Holmes says in different ways and in different places in his teaching, particularly when we get into specific work as practitioner being one who very consciously and very deliberately works with the law of mind to produce tangible, specific results. Kind of the best way that I can say it. Holmes calls the actual practice of treatment the art of inducing thought. The art of inducing thought. We're artists. I love that. We're artists. We're artists in this world that is so magnificent. It goes so far beyond our ability to understand. And yet, we are allowed to draw in it. We are allowed to create in it. We are allowed to create our own experience. So what Dr. Holmes asks us to consider is that in back of or in front of, however you want to look at it, before, there is a prototype, a spiritual prototype for everything that is here. Everything that is here. So in the analogy that Selby gave us, we have the divine energy, the divine mind, the divine love. We have the intention and the enthusiasm of God that is projecting itself like a laser, projecting itself through this image of perfection, this prototype of perfection. And then you can imagine that there's this image is kind of coming down into our 3D experience here. The perfection of life, the perfection of love, the perfection of all that we see. And what Dr. Holmes tells us then is when we are going into our treatment work for ourselves or for another with their permission, remember that always with their permission, that when we are going into our treatment work, we don't have to tell the law, we don't have to tell the divine mind, we don't have to tell the doer of the word what it's supposed to look like when we're done, because it already knows. It already knows the perfection because it came from perfection. You see? We have to get out of the appearances of the three-dimensional experience, and we have to bring our consciousness back to this place of perfection. Disease does not exist there. Sin does not exist there. Sickness does not exist there. Death does not exist there. Emma Curtis Hopkins, in one of the very first chapters of her book, she says that one of the first things that we have to recognize on our spiritual path is that there's no such thing as sin. There's no such thing as sickness. There's no such thing as disease. You see, and we might say, well, how can you say that? All three of those are evident around us in abundance. Bad things are happening all the time, you know. People are getting sick and dying all of the time. What is going on around here? And she's speaking from that level that exists before this existence. And in reality, that is the reality, and this is the experience. So we don't deny the experience of these things while we are here in this place, but we deny the reality of them. We deny the necessity of them. They have no power of their own to propagate themselves. Matter cannot create itself. There is something back of, there is something before. And what we want to do is we want to bring our consciousness to that place before. We want to bring our consciousness into that perfection. So let's use that image then. Let's use that image that Selby gives us. You know, I like to use the image of when we go to the movie theater. Back in the days when they actually had film running through, a film strip running through a projector, you know. And many of us would go to the movies and you could see that beam of light coming out of the booth, you know. And you could hear the clatter of the machinery going as the film strip was running through. And if you remember ever when you're at the movies, every once in a while a film strip would break, you know, and you'd hear the reel go blap 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 blap. Everybody would start going boo, you know. The projectionists had to splice the film and resume the movie. But the light in the projector, I want you to consider that to be the perfection of God. The light in the projector is the energy, is the force, is the animating force. And it will project onto that screen whatever is on the film. And it makes no judgment. It doesn't care. Makes no judgment as to what the content of the film might be. It could be a very tender love story, or it could be a very violent movie. The light in a projector doesn't care. But it shines through that film strip, and it projects into the experience of the people in the theater. It projects into that experience whatever's on the film. Now, of course, then there's another dimension to that, because if there's 100 people in the theater watching the same movie, they're probably having 100 different experiences. Because as I said, not only are we limited, excuse me, in what comes into us through our senses, based on the actual physical limitation of the senses. We can't hear certain things, we can't see certain things. But even with that, of all of the things that we can see and all of the things that we can hear, we still only take in part of it. We can't take in everything that is we're capable of seeing and hearing. We can't take it in and process it all at the same time. So what happens is we kind of select, we kind of allow in to our field of awareness that which we are attuned to. Perhaps that's the best way to put it, to attune to, you know. So the example there is that right now, this very instant, as you and I are sitting here together, there are many, many, many radio signals and television signals passing through the air, passing through our bodies. And each is broadcasting at a specific frequency. And the radio receivers have to be attuned to that exact frequency in order to receive it. So you may remember in the olden days when we actually had a dial, and you turned the dial and it moved the cord in the inside the receiver, and it turned a series of metal plates inside a tuner that kind of changed the resonant frequency. But you could hear when you started to turn the dial, you could hear, and you know, as you were kind of going through the different channels, you could hear it. And when you got to the one that you wanted, when you got to the program that you wanted, you stopped. See? And from that moment on, the radio receiver was attuned to that particular station. You could listen to what was on that particular station. I'm just having memories here of when I was a little guy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. My dad had this big old black radio, and it had shortwave frequencies, it had marine band frequencies, it had everything on it. And my mom used to listen to the soap operas. Before they were on television, the soap operas were on the radio. And that was my job. It was a certain time she'd say, "Jimmy, go tune in my stories." And I would go, and she would let me work that knob. You know, and of course, after a while, you learn where the needle on the dial is. You learn about where that channel is going to be, and then you tune it in. But what we have to keep in mind is that while we are attuned to that one frequency, we are not attuned. We are ignoring everything else, right? So we have selected that which we are going to let into our radio receiver, and we are in essence rejecting everything else. And in fact, that's kind of the performance curve of the tuners was how narrow a slice of the radio spectrum they would select, and how steeply they would reject everything else, so you didn't get crosstalk and those kind of things. So I want you to think of your consciousness as being a tuner like that. We have all of this perfection around us, everywhere present. We have God's perfect love everywhere present. We have the intelligence that knows how to guide this tiny little sparrow from North Africa to England, using means that we're just barely understanding. You know, scientists have only begun to talk about such things as quantum entanglements since the early part of the 1900s. So let's say in the last 100 years, the human intellect, which we are so proud of, the human intellect is only becoming aware of something that this little creature has done for thousands of years without any knowledge of how. So the perfection is there. The goodness is there. The beauty is there, but we don't always see it. We don't always experience it because it has to pass through the filters of our consciousness. So I want to kind of add another layer to this analogy then. So we have the love of God, which is the motive force of the universe. The motive force of the universe, the love of God. And the love of God is like the laser. It is shining through this prototype of perfection, this, in Selby's example, this hologram, this 2D hologram of perfection. And then that image of perfection is being projected into this 3D world, but then it has to pass through the filter of our consciousness. Going back, and I realize I'm mixing examples for you, but going back to the image of the projector, in the movie theater, the light comes through the film strip. But then it has to pass through a lens to be focused on the screen. So even though the image on the film strip may be perfectly crisp and sharp and clear, if the lens has an imperfection in it, if the lens has a smudge on it, if the lens has got a bubble of air somewhere in it when it was formed, the image on the screen is going to be less than perfect. Right? So we have the perfect energy, the perfect love of God, the perfect compulsion of God, desiring to experience joy through each and every one of us in some sort of a unique, wonderful way. Okay? And it is passing through this spiritual prototype of perfection. But then it has to pass through the lens of our unique personality, the lens of our unique belief system, before it can actually manifest itself here. So this is why sometimes we say, well, listen, if God is already perfect, and if when I'm doing my treatment work, I'm not trying to tell God what perfection looks like because God already knows. What I'm trying to do is accept the perfection that is already there. What we tend to wind up with then is if God is so good, how come I'm experiencing this difficulty? How come I'm having this problem? And the answer is there's dirt on the lens. There's a smudge on the lens. That's all. That's all. And our job, if you want to call it our job or our task or what it is that we need to do to experience the perfection, is to remove the dirt, is to let the dirt be gone. Now here we kind of run into a problem. We kind of run into a problem sometimes where we think, well, how do I do that? How do I go up there and how do I do that? What did I do to get dirt on the lens? What was I thinking? What did I do? All that kind of stuff. And I love what Joel Goldsmith tells us. He says, don't ever personalize the trouble. It is not your trouble. You did not create the trouble. You did not earn the trouble. You got the trouble because you are part of the human race. And race consciousness believes in the necessity of all these things. If you don't believe me, listen to the statistics that come on. In cold and flu season, they're going to say, well, 18.2% of the population is going to get the flu this year. That's a belief in a necessity that 18.2% of the people are going to get sick. That is the dirt of the race consciousness. That is the smudge of the race consciousness. Because we are human, we are exposed to that. And because we are exposed to that, we sometimes get a little bit on us. And that's all that's happening. If you went out for a walk after this talk, if you went out for a walk, and when you got back home, you realized that you had stepped in some chewing gum along the way, what would you do? You'd probably go get something to scrape it off your foot, right? But you wouldn't go back out and retrace your steps and go all around every place that you went and look on the ground until you found the smudge that looks like the gum that you stepped in. It's not necessary for you to know how that gum got there, whose gum it was, what flavor it was, how long it's been there, or why you stepped in it when you could have stepped all around it. None of that is necessary. What you want to do is get the gum off your shoe. And the next time you go for a walk, you'll probably be a little bit more careful. So, well, I'm just going to scan the ground a little bit, make sure I don't step into some more chewing gum. So what we want to do when we are experiencing a difficulty of some sort in our lives is not worry about how the smudge got on the lens, not worry about where our consciousness somehow didn't accept the perfection that is there. What we want to do is move right beyond that. We want to bring our consciousness right beyond that to the point where the perfection already is and no perfection exists. No perfection exists. The Hindus have a saying that the beam of light can pass through 1,000 miles of darkness and not once be affected by the darkness. Think about how wonderful that is. There's another thing that's amazing, you know. How far does a beam of light travel? I was watching a series of videos on YouTube by a fellow who's a complete skeptic of what modern science is saying, you know. And he may be a bit of a nut, but I enjoy watching him because he raises the questions that you probably the question is worth exploring at least a little bit, you know, even if his positioning of it may be a little bit far out. But he said, think about how tiny your flashlight battery is. And yet if you turn your flashlight and you shine it out into space, how far that beam of light will go. Yeah. How does that happen? How does that happen? How can the energy that's contained in this one little flashlight battery, you know, some of these flashlight batteries have little tiny AAA batteries and they have LEDs, very low voltage LEDs, and they produce very, very bright light. And how amazing is it that energy can go that far out, you know? So what we want to do is we want to recognize that just as the power of darkness, if you wish to consider such a thing, just as the power of darkness can't stop the minute energy from your little AAA battery from sending this beam of light through the darkness, that these things that we call negative experiences, negative ideas, evil, if you will, sin, if you want to call it that, all of these things, they have no power to stop the light. They have no power to stop the light. They have no power to stop God's perfection. So another example we sometimes use is a photographer's darkroom. When back in the olden days when we used to develop photographs in chemicals, and some people still do it for a hobby. But the photographer would build a room in the house that was completely dark. They would seal off all the light. Now you can take a room such as that, and you can make sure that every nook and every cranny and every possible opening is completely sealed. And when you do so, when you turn off the light, it gets pitch dark in there. Darker than you've ever experienced it. I don't know if you ever go on one of the walking tours of the caverns, the different caverns in the country, usually there's a spot where they get everybody and they say, and now we're going to turn off the lights so you can experience complete darkness. And they turn off the lights, and it is the darkest dark that you have ever experienced in your whole life. There's no light coming in there whatsoever. But you see, the instant they turn that light back on, the instant they throw that switch, the darkness is gone. Now, if you had a dark room and it was completely sealed and you turn a light on, it would be light. But where did the darkness go? It didn't have a crack to crawl out underneath the door. It couldn't go out the window. See, it appeared as an experience, but it did not have the power to sustain itself. As soon as the light came on, the darkness disappeared. So this is why we might say, well, the darkness was an illusion. An illusion in that it did not have the power to project itself. I can't turn the light on and have the dark struggle with the light and hear a little groan and a little moan as the two wrestle. And then eventually one of them wins, and then the room lights up if it's the light, or the room stays dark if it's the dark. That doesn't happen. So we want to think of any ideas that we have stepped in along the way, any ideas that are limiting this experience of the perfection that already exists. We want to think of them just as we would think of the darkness. They don't have the power to sustain themselves. They have no more power than the power that we give to them. And the way that we eliminate them, the way that we get the gum off of our shoe, the way that we eliminate them is to focus on the perfection. And to know that there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. If I believe that that power is right now working with me and for me and through me and as me, and is allowing the perfection that already exists to shine through the appearance of limitation, then the ideas that were distorting the perfection as it came in, they become dissolved. What we are doing, quite simply, is we are turning the dial and attuning our consciousness to a different experience. Rocco Errico, in his work on the Aramaic scripture, says that the word for prayer was more like the word for attune. And he goes through in his work on the Lord's Prayer, he goes through and he says there's 8 spiritual attunements. That saying the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, there are 8 specific attunements or 8 specific statements in there that the one praying, the prayer, that the one praying through the act of performing that prayer can start to reattune their consciousness to the goodness that already is, instead of the appearances of lack and limitation and sickness that only exists because the consciousness is not quite attuned. That's it. That's all there is to it. Not quite attuned. So what we come to then is we have a choice, we have an ability, we have the responsibility, right? The ability to respond, but also we have the accountability. So let me just briefly talk about responsibility and accountability. So the responsibility is the one who is able to do something. But the accountability is the one who experiences the consequences of that something getting done or not getting done. So perhaps you're an investor and a silent partner. We talked about a silent partner a couple of weeks ago. So perhaps you're a silent partner and you take your life savings and you give your life savings to someone who wants to go and operate a business. Now they have the responsibility to operate that business. But if that business fails, you lose all your money. You are accountable. If that business is a success, you get a return on your investment. You are also accountable. And of course, the manager that is operating the business also shares a certain amount of accountability because they're getting paid and perhaps getting a bonus and all those kind of things. So in our lives, for you and I, we are responsible for attuning our consciousness. I remember last week I said there's one thing that we can do that no one can do for us. You have to attune your consciousness. That's it. But not only are you able to do that, you are accountable for doing it. You are the one who experiences the consequences of doing it or not doing it. So whatever we're working on in life, and believe me, we don't always have to be working on a trouble. We don't always have to be working on solving a problem. Something doesn't seem to be going right in our lives. What tends to happen is we go along, everything's going great, we go along, and then whoops, something happens. We say, oh, now what do I need to do? I need to do something now to get reattuned with God. In the Old Testament, we were given the commandment to keep holy the Sabbath, keep holy the Lord's Day. And Emmett Fox says that that's a wonderful rule for people who need to take time out, who need to be told, you have to take time out of your busyness, you have to take time out of your work, you have to take time out of everything else. Not just to rest, not just to take it easy, but you have to take time to contemplate God. And then Emmett Fox tells us that after a while, one day is not enough. And then 2 days is not enough. And then what we have to do is contemplate God at all times, to pray without ceasing. In the midst of our work, in the midst of our business, in the midst of driving our cars, in the midst of going about all of the daily things that we do, we attune our consciousness to experience the love and the presence and the activity of God in everyone we meet, especially in the ones who make us mad. In everyone we meet. So what I invite each and every one to consider this week, you are the only one who can turn the dial. You are the only one who can take the time to bring your consciousness, your mind, your thoughts, your feelings, to bring them to the perfection that already exists. To, when you see something that appears opposite of that perfection, to deny the reality of it, in that it does not have the power to sustain itself. It only exists as an appearance because the perfection that already is has somehow been distorted through a smudge on the lens or a false idea in our consciousness. And we did not put the false idea there. We just picked it up because it existed in race consciousness, just as we didn't put the gum on the street that we stepped in. You see? So we don't waste time trying to figure out who put that there. There's a fable that comes to us from, I believe it's from Hindu teachings, and it's about a man who went into battle, and this is in the days of bows and arrows, and he was shot with a poison arrow. And his friends carried him off the battlefield to the doctor, and they're going to go in there and they're going to cut the arrow out because they have to get the poison out of him. And the doctor goes to start cutting him. He says, wait. He says, look at the feathers on this arrow. I've never seen feathers like that. I wonder what kind of bird they came from. And the doctor says, I don't know. And the doctor goes, he says, wait. He says, look at the wood in the shaft of this arrow. He says, I don't know that I've ever seen wood like that. What kind of a tree do you think this wood came from? The doctor says, I don't know. The doctor goes to cut him. He says, wait. He says, look at the stripes that are painted on this shaft. He says, I've never seen stripes that are painted in such a manner. He says, what nature of people, what tribe of people do you think mark their arrows with this symbol, And the doctor says, I don't know, but I do know if I don't cut the poison out of you, you will die. We don't need to waste time trying to figure out how the smudge got on our lens. We don't need to waste that time. Goldsmith says, just recognize that you are swimming in the swamp of life and you got mud on you. And the way to get it off is to move beyond. Go to the perfection. Recognize that which is perfect has never, ever been affected by that which appears to be imperfect. And that any and every limiting idea is now dissolved from consciousness. And believe that the power of prayer, the power of treatment, the law of mind, believe that it is working with you and for you right now to reattune your consciousness to a different experience. A different experience, so that as you walk into life, as you walk into your day, you will see the gifts that have already been given. You will see the beauty that is all around you. You will sense and feel the power and the presence. And you will know. See, that little sparrow doesn't know. As far as we can tell, it doesn't know how magnificent it is. It doesn't know what a remarkable thing that it's able to do. But we have been given that gift of awareness. We have been given the ability to know. In our readings with Selby and the corresponding readings that we're doing, the scientists are talking about the hard problem of consciousness. Why does consciousness even exist? How does consciousness even exist? What is consciousness, And they can understand if you think of living organisms as you would think of a computer, they can understand how they have intelligence. They understand how chemically a leaf can tell which way the sun is shining. They can understand those things. But they can't understand why we are consciously aware. We are consciously aware, but why? What is the purpose of our consciousness? And of course I would say it's love. Pure love. And it's so that we can deliberately attune ourselves to a greater experience. Dream big. Dream big, as Wendy's told us. Because that which has created the universe and has created you and I to express its life joyfully here supports us no matter how big our dream can be. We can't outspend God. We can't outgive God. We can't outlove God. So dream big. Deliberately keep holy the Sabbath. That is your sacred time of attuning your consciousness to God. And let the power that responds to us according to our belief dissolve everything unlike God's perfection. And so it is.